The spring of 1962 brought unusually warm weather to Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. The trees had blossomed early that year, and the gardens of the old Victorian homes were alive with color. Among these elegant houses stood the Whitfield residence, a 3-story brownstone with ivy climbing its walls and wrought iron fencing protecting its perimeter. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair always styled in a perfect bun, lived alone in this grand home since her husband's passing 5 years earlier. Though widowed, she maintained her position in Boston's high society through her regular music soirees, which had become something of a legend among the city's elite. These gatherings weren't just social events. They were carefully orchestrated displays of culture and refinement. Every detail mattered to Eleanor, from the selection of cheeses on the serving platters to the precisely arranged flowers in crystal vases. But nothing mattered more than the music. Eleanor had studied piano in her youth at a conservatory in Vienna, and while she no longer played due to arthritis in her hands, her ear remained impeccable. She could detect a missed note from across a crowded room and often did, much to the embarrassment of the performers. On this particular Thursday morning, Eleanor sat at her mahogany desk in the morning room, reviewing her guest list for Saturday's soiree. She had invited 32 people, including a visiting conductor from the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and several patrons of the arts whose checkbooks were as notable as their taste in music. She tapped her fountain pen against the paper, mentally rehearsing the evening. Everything was in order: the catering, the flowers, the drinks. The telephone's sharp ring interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor sighed at the disturbance but rose to answer it. "Whitfield residence," she answered, her voice crisp and formal. "Mrs. Whitfield. It's Richard Alderman." The voice on the other end belonged to her regular pianist, a young man who had graduated from the New England Conservatory and who, in Eleanor's opinion, played Chopin with acceptable skill. "Yes, Mr. Alderman, I trust you're calling to confirm our arrangement for Saturday evening." There was a pause and the sound of coughing. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Whitfield. I've come down with a terrible case of bronchitis. My doctor has forbidden me to leave bed rest for at least a week." Eleanor felt a flash of irritation, followed quickly by panic. "But the soiree is in 2 days. Surely you can manage one evening of light playing." "I'm truly sorry," Richard replied between coughs that did sound alarmingly real. "I can barely sit up, let alone perform. Dr. Barnes was quite clear about the risks of pneumonia if I push myself." After a few more minutes of useless persuasion, Eleanor hung up the phone and pressed her fingers to her temples. 2 days wasn't nearly enough time to find a replacement of suitable caliber. Most of the musicians in her circle were already booked for weekend performances. A soiree without music was unthinkable. It would be the talk of Beacon Hill, and not in the way Eleanor preferred to be discussed. She was still pondering her dilemma when she heard the service entrance open and close. It would be Maria, her maid of 15 years, arriving for her Thursday cleaning. Maria was one of the few constants in Eleanor's life, reliable, hardworking, and discreet. She came 3 times a week to maintain the large home, a job she performed with quiet efficiency. Eleanor made her way to the kitchen to discuss the week's grocery needs and stopped short at the doorway. Maria wasn't alone. A boy of about 12 stood beside her, thin and tall for his age, with warm brown skin a shade lighter than his mother's, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the kitchen. "Good morning." "Mrs. Whitfield," Maria said, her voice carrying the soft traces of her Georgia upbringing despite decades in the North. "I hope you don't mind. My son's school is closed today for teacher meetings, and my sister, who usually watches him, had to take her baby to the doctor." Eleanor had known, in an abstract way, that Maria had a child. There had been a period years ago when Maria had needed time off for the birth, but the boy had never before entered her awareness as a real person who took up space in the world. She looked at him with surprise, noting his neat appearance: pressed khaki pants, a clean blue shirt, and shoes that had been polished with care. "This is Theodore," Maria added when Eleanor didn't immediately respond. "Theo, say hello to Mrs. Whitfield." The boy stepped forward and extended his hand with a politeness that seemed beyond his years. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," he said, his voice still carrying the high notes of childhood but with a distinct formality that mirrored his mother's. Eleanor shook his hand briefly. "Yes, well, Theodore, you must stay out of the way while your mother works. Perhaps you can read quietly in the kitchen. Yes, ma'am, Theo replied, pulling a worn copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn from his small backpack. Eleanor turned back to Maria. Mr. Alderman has fallen ill and canceled his performance for Saturday's soiree. It's a disaster, really. I have the Hawthorns coming, and they just returned from a season at the Metropolitan Opera. What will they think of an evening without music? Maria nodded sympathetically as she tied her apron. That is unfortunate, Mrs. Whitfield. Perhaps one of your guests plays? Mrs. Cabot mentioned once she had studied piano. Eleanor scoffed. Millicent Cabot can barely manage for Elise, and even that sounds like she's wearing mittens. No, I need someone with real ability. She sighed dramatically. I suppose I'll have to call the conservatory and see if they can recommend a student, though the quality will be so unpredictable. She was about to leave when she noticed Theo had looked up from his book, a curious expression on his face. The boy quickly lowered his eyes when he caught her glance. Maria noticed the exchange and hesitated before speaking. Theo takes piano lessons at our church, Mrs. Whitfield. He's been playing for 3 years now. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. Does he? She said, not bothering to hide her skepticism. Church piano lessons would hardly prepare someone for a Beacon Hill soiree. Maria nodded. He plays for the choir sometimes when Mrs. Bell, our regular pianist, is sick. She paused. He's quite good, actually. His teacher says he has a gift. Every mother thinks her child has a gift, Eleanor thought, but didn't say. Still, her options were limited and desperation was beginning to set in. What sort of music does he play? She asked, glancing at the boy. Before Maria could answer, Theo spoke up. I can play Bach's Minuet in G major and Chopin's Prelude in E minor, ma'am. And some hymns and spirituals, too. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Those weren't beginner pieces. Bach and Chopin? She repeated, Yes, ma'am, Theo replied. Mr. Washington, he's my teacher at church. He lets me try the harder pieces because he says I have good hands for it. Eleanor studied the boy more carefully now. His hands were indeed notable, long-fingered and graceful with a span that would widen with age. Pianist's hands. Would you play something for me, Theodore? Just a short piece so I might hear your level of skill? Theo looked to his mother, who nodded encouragement. Go ahead, honey. You can show Mrs. Whitfield what you've been practicing. Eleanor led them to the formal living room where her Steinway grand piano stood by the bay windows. It was a magnificent instrument, regularly tuned and maintained, its black surface gleaming in the morning light. She watched as Theo approached it with reverence, his eyes wide. May I? He asked, gesturing to the bench. Please, Eleanor replied, curious despite her doubts. Theo sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys with surprising confidence. After a moment's pause, he began to play. The opening notes of Bach's Minuet in G major filled the room. Eleanor had expected a simplified version, played with the halting uncertainty of a beginner. Instead, Theo's interpretation was fluid, with precise fingering and a natural sense of the music's architecture. More surprising still was his evident joy in playing, his face transformed, losing its careful politeness and revealing genuine passion. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor, awaiting her verdict. That was... Eleanor paused, recalibrating her expectations. That was quite well played, Theodore. Could you try the Chopin piece you mentioned? Theo nodded and, without sheet music, began the haunting E minor prelude. Here, his playing revealed not just technical skill but emotional depth. The melancholy beauty of the piece seemed to flow through him, his young face serious with concentration. Eleanor felt a strange sensation in her chest, a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't immediately identify. When Theo finished, the final notes hanging in the air like a question, she realized what it was: opportunity. Theodore, she said, how would you feel about playing a few pieces at my gathering this Saturday evening? There would be about 30 guests, all lovers of good music. You would play for perhaps 45 minutes with breaks between pieces, of course. Theo's eyes widened. Me, ma'am. Play for your party? Maria stepped forward. Mrs. Whitfield, that's very kind, but Theo's never played for such an important audience. I'm not sure. I'd like to try. Theo interrupted, then looked embarrassed at his eagerness. I mean, if you think I could do it, ma'am? Eleanor nodded slowly. I believe you could, Theodore. We would need to select an appropriate program, and you would need proper attire, but I think this might work quite well. She turned to Maria. He would need to come early on Saturday to practice on the Steinway. It's different from what he's used to, I imagine. Maria's expression was a mix of pride and concern. Yes, ma'am. If you're sure. I am, Eleanor replied, already mentally revising her plans for the soiree. We'll call it a showcase of young talent. The novelty might actually enhance the evening. What Eleanor didn't say was how much. She was counting on that novelty and on the low expectations her guests would have for a maid's son to make the evening a success despite the last-minute change. It was a calculated risk, but one that seemed increasingly better than the alternative of no music at all. As Maria returned to her cleaning duties with Theo in tow, Eleanor returned to her morning room, her mind buzzing with plans. She had no idea that her desperate solution was about to change 3 lives forever. Saturday arrived with unexpected speed. For Eleanor, the intervening days had been filled with phone calls to guests, explaining the change in entertainment with careful emphasis on the discovery of a young talent. She had spent Friday afternoon selecting pieces with Theo, testing his repertoire and finding, to her continued surprise, that it was more extensive than she had initially believed. For Theo, the 2 days had passed in a blur of nervous practice. Every free moment had been spent at the church piano, his fingers moving over the keys until Mrs. Bell, the church secretary, gently shooed him home well after sunset. At night he practiced silently, his fingers tapping out rhythms on his bed cover while he visualized the keyboard in his mind. Maria had spent the time worrying. She sat now in the Whitfield kitchen, a cup of tea growing cold between her hands as she listened to the grandfather clock in the hallway strike 4. The guests wouldn't arrive until 7, but Eleanor had requested that Theo come early to become comfortable with the Steinway. In the adjoining laundry room, she could hear her son changing into his church suit, his only formal attire, freshly pressed and waiting on a hanger since yesterday. You ready, honey? She called, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. Almost, Mama, came Theo's reply, followed by the sound of a zipper. When he emerged, Maria's heart swelled with pride and fear in equal measure. Her son stood taller in his navy blue suit, the jacket a bit short at the wrists after his recent growth spurt. His white shirt gleamed against his dark skin, and the red tie, a Christmas gift from his uncle, added a spot of brightness. He had polished his shoes to a mirror shine. You look so handsome, she said, rising to straighten his tie. Just like your father in that suit. Theo smiled at the comparison. His father had died when Theo was only 4, leaving him with hazy memories of a tall man with a deep laugh who had once held his small hands over piano keys. Do you think Papa would be proud? About me playing here tonight? Maria swallowed the sudden lump in her throat. So proud he wouldn't be able to keep from telling every person he met. She brushed an invisible speck from his shoulder. Now remember, when those fancy folks arrive, you just focus on the music. Don't worry about their faces or what they might be thinking. Yes, Mama? Theo nodded, but his eyes betrayed his nerves. The kitchen door swung open, and Eleanor appeared, already dressed in a midnight blue evening gown with a strand of pearls at her throat. Her eyes scanned Theo critically. The suit will do, she said after a moment, though the sleeves are a bit short. No matter. People will be looking at your hands, not your cuffs. She turned to Maria. The caterers have arrived and need direction about the serving platters. I'd like Theodore to come with me to the piano now. Maria squeezed Theo's shoulder before releasing him. I'll be right out here if you need anything, she said softly. You're going to be wonderful. Theo followed Eleanor through the service door and down a short hallway that opened into the grand living room. In daylight he had thought the Steinway impressive. Now, with evening approaching and the lamps casting a warm glow over its polished surface, it looked almost magical. The room had been transformed since Thursday as well. The everyday furniture had been rearranged to create space for rows of gilt chairs facing the piano. Crystal glasses sparkled on trays ready for champagne, and arrangements of white roses and lilies scented the air. Sit, Eleanor directed, gesturing to the piano bench. Play through your program once, as we discussed. I need to check on a few things, but I'll be listening. As she moved away, Theo settled onto the bench, his heart hammering against his ribs. He flexed his fingers, then placed them on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath his fingertips. He began with Bach, the familiar notes of the minuet in G major steadying him. The Steinway responded differently than the old upright at church. more sensitive to his touch with a richer tone that filled the room. He moved from Bach to Mozart, then to the Chopin prelude that had so impressed Mrs. Whitfield. As he played, he gradually forgot his surroundings, forgot the borrowed grandeur, and his own anxiety. There was only the music, flowing from his hands as naturally as breath. He didn't notice Eleanor pausing in the doorway, watching with an expression of growing satisfaction. Nor did he see Maria standing in the shadow of the service entrance, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was the sound of the doorbell that finally broke his concentration. Theo's hand stilled on the keys as he realized the time for practice was over. Eleanor swept back into the room. "That will be the Hawthorns. They always arrive precisely on time," she said. "You may wait in the small parlor until everyone has arrived. I'll introduce you after drinks have been served." Theo retreated to the designated room, a cozy space lined with bookshelves. Through the partially closed door, he could hear the growing sounds of arrival, the murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, laughter. He tried to focus on the books around him, running a finger along their leather spines and reading titles to distract himself. Time passed strangely, stretching and compressing like an accordion. It might have been 20 minutes or an hour when Eleanor appeared at the door. "It's time," she said. "Follow me, but wait by the entrance until I introduce you." Theo trailed after her, his mouth suddenly dry. The living room was now filled with people, men in dark suits and women in colorful dresses, jewelry catching the light as they moved. The noise level dropped as Eleanor stepped forward to address her guests. "Friends, as you know, our usual musical entertainment, Mr. Alderman, was unfortunately taken ill this week," she began. "However, I believe you will be pleasantly surprised by our replacement this evening. It is my privilege to introduce a young pianist of remarkable promise, Theodore Williams." She gestured toward Theo, who stepped forward on legs that felt like water. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Surprise, curiosity, and something else that made his skin prickle. He saw eyebrows raise, glances exchanged. One woman leaned to whisper something to her companion behind a gloved hand. "Theodore is the son of my housekeeper, Maria," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "He has been studying piano at his church for 3 years and has agreed to share his talent with us tonight. Please welcome him." There was polite applause as Theo made his way to the piano bench. As he sat adjusting his position, he caught sight of his mother standing at the back of the room. She smiled encouragement, and he straightened his shoulders. He could do this, for her, for himself, for the music he loved. Theo began with the Bach piece, his hands trembling slightly on the first few notes. He heard a cough, the rustle of a program, someone whispering. His finger slipped, hitting a wrong note that seemed to hang in the air like a judgment. He paused, took a deep breath, and began again. This time the notes flowed correctly but mechanically. He was playing the music without feeling it, too aware of the watching eyes, the listening ears, the expectations he couldn't possibly meet. The piece ended, and there was scattered applause, the kind that acknowledged effort rather than excellence. Theo moved to the Mozart sonata, his heart still racing. The opening bars felt stiff under his fingers. Then somehow, in the middle of the second movement, something shifted. Perhaps it was the music itself, with its inherent joy that was impossible to play without feeling. Perhaps it was catching sight of Maria's face, shining with pride regardless of his performance. Whatever the cause, Theo felt the tension in his shoulders release. The music began to come alive under his hands. By the time he reached the Chopin prelude, he had forgotten the audience entirely. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, his face reflecting the changing emotions of the piece. The final notes of the prelude faded, and in the silence that followed, Theo felt a moment of pure peace. Then the applause began. Not the polite patter of before, but a genuine response. He looked up to see surprise on many faces and on some a dawning respect. Eleanor stood at the side of the room, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. Emboldened by the response, Theo moved to the piece he had been most nervous about, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. It was the most challenging work in his limited repertoire, one he had only recently mastered. The haunting triplets filled the room as he navigated the flowing arpeggios, building the emotional landscape of the piece. When the final chord resolved, there was a moment of complete silence before the applause erupted, stronger now, with a few calls of "Bravo!" from the back of the room. Theo stood and bowed as Maria had coached him, his face flushed with the effort and the unexpected triumph. As he made his way back to the small parlor for the intermission Eleanor had planned, he passed between groups of guests who looked at him with new interest. He caught fragments of conversation. Natural talent, wouldn't you say? Never heard the moonlight played with such feeling by one so young. Where did Eleanor find him? The church, she said. Extraordinary. In the parlor, Theo sank onto a small chair, his hand still tingling from the piano keys, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The door opened and Maria slipped in, her face radiant. They love you, she whispered, kneeling beside his chair. I told you, didn't I? I told you that God gave you something special. Before Theo could respond, the door opened again. Eleanor entered, followed by a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Theodore, she said. This is Mr. Harrington. He is a professor at the New England Conservatory and would like to speak with you. Theo stood, wiping his damp palm on his trousers before extending his hand. As Mr. Harrington took it, his intense gaze seemed to look right through the boy to something beyond. Young man, he said, his voice deep and measured. I have a few questions about your musical background. And just like that, with his mother's eyes on him and a room full of Boston's elite waiting for his return to the piano, Theo knew that his life was about to change forever. Mr. Harrington led Theo and Maria to a quiet corner of Eleanor's library, away from the buzz of conversation in the main room. Bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes surrounded them, and the soft glow of a brass lamp cast shadows across the oriental carpet. Eleanor followed, closing the heavy oak door behind them to ensure privacy. Please sit. Mr. Harrington gestured to a pair of wingback chairs. Theo and Maria perched on the edges, neither quite able to relax in such formal surroundings. Mr. Harrington remained standing, his tall frame imposing as he studied Theo with undisguised interest. Young man, I've been teaching piano at the conservatory for 27 years, he began, his voice carrying the precise diction of someone who chose words carefully. In that time, I've heard thousands of students play. Some skilled, some merely adequate, but rarely, very rarely, do I encounter what I heard tonight. Theo glanced at his mother, unsure how to respond to what sounded like praise but could have been criticism. Thank you, sir, he said finally, the words barely audible. Tell me, Mr. Harrington continued, who taught you to play Beethoven with such emotional depth? The technical elements can be learned, of course, but that understanding of the music's heart, that's something else entirely. Theo shifted in his seat. Mr. Washington at my church taught me the basics, sir. But mostly I listen to records and try to feel what the composer was saying. Then I try to say it back through my fingers. Mr. Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. Records? Whose performances do you listen to? Mrs. Whitfield has a big collection, Theo explained, gaining confidence as he spoke about music. Sometimes when my mama cleans here, I can hear them playing. There's one by someone named Rubinstein that I really like. His Chopin sounds like he's telling you a story. Maria looked startled at this revelation, clearly unaware that her son had been absorbing music from Eleanor's record collection during her workdays. Arthur Rubinstein. Mr. Harrington nodded appreciatively. An excellent influence. And your other teachers? Before Mr. Washington? Theo hesitated, glancing at Maria again. There weren't any others, sir, Maria said quietly. We can't afford private lessons. Mr. Washington teaches Theo for free because he plays for church services. Sometimes, Mr. Harrington's expression shifted from interest to something more complex, surprise mingled with what might have been indignation. You mean to tell me, he said slowly, that this boy has had no formal training beyond church lessons? No conservatory preparation? No theory classes? No, sir, Maria replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Just what he could pick up himself and what Mr. Washington could show him on Sundays. Mr. Harrington turned to Eleanor, who had been observing the exchange with growing satisfaction. Eleanor, do you realize what you've stumbled upon here? He gestured toward Theo. This boy has more natural talent than half my undergraduate students. With proper training. He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. Eleanor smiled, a hint of smugness playing at her lips. I suspected as much when I first heard him play. That's why I arranged for you to be here tonight, Charles. Theo looked between the adults, trying to understand what was happening. Sir, he ventured, does this mean I played okay? Mr. Harrington let out a short laugh. Okay, young man, you played with more musicality than many trained pianists twice your age. What you lack is technique and theory, the scaffolding to support your natural gifts. But those can be taught. He paused, considering. How old are you, Theodore? 12, sir. 13 next month. Perfect age to begin serious study, Mr. Harrington muttered almost to himself. He turned to Maria. Mrs. Williams, I would like to offer your son an audition at the conservatory's preparatory division. We have a program for gifted young musicians that provides training beyond what's available in most schools. Maria's eyes widened. An audition? At the conservatory? Yes. Based on what I've heard tonight, I have little doubt he would qualify for admission. Mr. Harrington hesitated, then added more gently, there would be scholarship possibilities. Of course, the unspoken reality hung in the air, that without financial assistance, such an opportunity would be beyond the Williams family's reach. Maria looked at her son, whose face had lit up with cautious hope. Theo, is this something you'd want? Yes, Mama, he answered without hesitation. More than anything. Before Maria could respond, a knock at the library door interrupted them. Eleanor opened it to reveal a slender woman in an emerald green dress, her silver hair arranged in an elegant updo. Eleanor, darling, your guests are wondering what's become of our young virtuoso, she said, her gaze traveling curiously over the group gathered in the library. The second half was promised for 8:30, and it's nearly that now. We'll be right there, Vivian, Eleanor assured her. Theodore is just discussing music with Professor Harrington. Interest sparked in Vivian's eyes. Charles Harrington? From the conservatory? She looked at Theo with new appreciation. Well, I'll tell everyone our pianist is receiving professional consultation. How delightful. After she departed, Mr. Harrington turned back to Theo. We should continue this conversation after your performance. Do you have any questions before you return to the piano? Theo thought for a moment. Sir, for the second half, I was going to play what Mrs. Whitfield and I planned. But, he hesitated, gathering courage. Could I maybe play something else at the end? Something that's not on the program? Eleanor frowned slightly. Theodore, we discussed the selections carefully. The Debussy would be the perfect conclusion. I know, ma'am, Theo said respectfully, and I'll play that. But after maybe I could play something else? Just one piece? Mr. Harrington studied the boy with interest. What did you have in mind? It's a piece I've been working on myself. I don't know who wrote it exactly. I mean, some of it comes from church music and some of it I just... Theo trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. You composed something? Mr. Harrington asked sharply. Not exactly composed, Theo said. More like, it's what I play when I'm just playing for myself. It changes a little each time. Maria looked surprised. You mean that music I sometimes hear from your room? I thought you were practicing your hymns. Theo shook his head. It's different every time, Mama. It depends on how I'm feeling. Mr. Harrington and Eleanor exchanged a glance of shared understanding. Improvisation, Mr. Harrington said softly. At 12, he turned to Eleanor. I believe we should let the boy play what he wishes. Eleanor considered this, then nodded. Very well, Theodore. After the Debussy, you may play your personal piece. Now we should return to our guests. The second half of Theo's performance built upon the success of the first. With his initial nerves conquered and bolstered by Mr. Harrington's praise, Theo played with growing confidence. His rendition of Debussy's Clair de Lune drew appreciative sighs from the audience, its dreamy qualities perfectly suited to the softly lit room and the mellowing effects of Eleanor's expensive champagne on her guests. When the final notes of the Debussy faded, Theo took a deep breath and turned slightly on the bench to address the audience, something he had not done before. Thank you all for listening tonight, he said, his young voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. Mrs. Whitfield has been very kind to let me play for you. With her permission, I'd like to share one last piece that isn't on your programs. It's something I play at home when I'm thinking about my father, who loved music but died before he could teach me much about it. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Eleanor, standing at the side of the room, looked momentarily taken aback by this personal revelation, but gave a small nod for him to continue. Theo turned back to the piano, closed his eyes briefly, and began to play. The opening notes were simple, a melody that echoed the spiritual deep river that he often heard at church. But as his fingers moved across the keys, the melody transformed. weaving in elements of classical phrases he had absorbed from Eleanor's records, touches of jazz rhythms he'd heard on the radio, and original passages that seemed to flow directly from his heart to his hands. The audience sat in stunned silence as the music built, becoming more complex and passionate before returning to the simple, haunting melody with which it had begun. When Theo finally lifted his hands from the keys, the room remained absolutely quiet for several heartbeats. Then Mr. Harrington rose to his feet, applauding with unrestrained enthusiasm. Others quickly followed, the applause swelling to fill the room. Several guests were dabbing at their eyes, moved by the unexpected emotional journey of the music. Maria stood at the back of the room, tears streaming freely down her face. Not tears of worry or fear as she had shed earlier, but tears of fierce pride and overwhelming joy. Her son, her Theo, who practiced on an old church piano because they couldn't afford one of their own, had just held a room full of Boston's elite in the palm of his hand. Eleanor made her way to the piano, her expression a mix of surprise and something that might almost have been respect. As the applause continued, she placed a hand on Theo's shoulder and leaned down to speak into his ear. "Theodore," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been absent before, "I believe we have much to discuss about your future." Mr. Harrington joined them at the piano, shaking his head in amazement. "Young man," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "what we just witnessed was extraordinary. Not just skill, but genuine artistry. The conservatory would be honored to count you among its students." As the implications of these words sank in, Theo felt a strange lightness spreading through his chest, as if his heart might float right out of his body. He looked past Eleanor and Mr. Harrington to find his mother's face in the crowd. When their eyes met across the room, he saw in her gaze what he had always longed for, the certainty that the music he heard inside himself was real and valuable and meant to be shared with the world. In that moment, surrounded by applause in a room that hours ago had felt impossibly foreign, Theodore Williams understood that his life had irrevocably changed. The door that had opened when Eleanor asked him to play had now swung wide, revealing a path he had only dared to dream about in the privacy of his heart. The following Monday morning found Eleanor seated at her desk, telephone pressed to her ear, her address book open before her. She had been making calls since 8 o'clock, her voice shifting between charm and authority depending on who was on the other end of the line. "Yes, Dean Phillips, I understand the application deadline has passed," she was saying, tapping her manicured nails against the polished wood. "However, I believe exceptions can be made for exceptional circumstances, and I assure you this boy's talent is most exceptional." She paused, listening to the response. "Of course. Professor Harrington has already spoken to you?" "Excellent. Then you understand the urgency?" "Yes. Next Monday would be perfect for the audition." "Thank you, Dean Phillips. I look forward to seeing you then." She replaced the receiver with a satisfied smile. Things were proceeding exactly as she had planned since Saturday night's revelation. Eleanor had always prided herself on her eye for quality and opportunity, whether in antiques, investments, or social connections. Theodore Williams represented all three, a rare talent discovered in her own home, a chance to make a worthwhile investment in a promising future, and an opportunity to be known as the patron who had discovered him. There was also, though she would never have admitted it aloud, a certain satisfaction in using her influence to open doors that would otherwise have remained firmly closed to someone like Theo. Eleanor was not a crusader for social causes. She had never marched for civil rights or attended rallies, but she believed in excellence, and the idea that excellence might be overlooked due to something as irrelevant as the color of one's skin offended her sense of proper order. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Whitfield residence," she answered. "Mrs. Whitfield." "This is Dr. Lawrence from the Belmont Academy," came a crisp voice. "I'm returning your call regarding scholarship possibilities." "Ah, Dr. Lawrence, thank you for calling back so promptly. As I mentioned in my message, I'm inquiring on behalf of a remarkably talented young pianist who requires a more rigorous academic environment than his current public school can provide." "Yes, you mentioned that. While Belmont does offer music scholarships, our academic year is already underway, and our scholarship funds are fully allocated." Eleanor's spine straightened. "I understand, Dr. Lawrence. However, I should mention that this young man will be auditioning for the New England Conservatory's preparatory program next week. Dean Phillips and Professor Harrington are both personally involved in his admission. I would imagine that any school fortunate enough to have such a student would benefit from the association when he begins performing publicly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see, Dr. Lawrence said finally. That does put things in a different light. Perhaps we could arrange for an interview and placement tests. If the young man's academic abilities match his musical talent, we might be able to work something out for the spring semester. That would be most accommodating, Eleanor replied. I'll have his mother contact your office to arrange the details. After concluding the call, Eleanor made a note in her planner, then rose from her desk. She had one more important conversation to have this morning, and it would need to be in person. She made her way to the kitchen, where Maria was polishing the silver tea service. The housekeeper looked up as Eleanor entered, her hand stilling on the silver pot. Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield, she said. Would you like some coffee? Later, perhaps. I'd like to speak with you about Theodore first. Maria nodded, setting down her polishing cloth. He hasn't stopped talking about Saturday night, or about what Mr. Harrington said. She hesitated. It's very kind of you to help arrange the audition. It's not kindness, Maria, Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. It's recognition of talent that deserves development. Which brings me to what I wanted to discuss. She took a seat at the kitchen table and motioned for Maria to join her. I've spoken with the conservatory, and Theodore's audition is scheduled for next Monday afternoon. I've also contacted Belmont Academy about academic scholarship possibilities. Maria's eyes widened. Belmont? But that's one of the finest private schools in Boston. Precisely. The conservatory program is only part-time. Theodore will still need a regular education, and his current school is unlikely to accommodate the demands of serious musical study. Eleanor watched Maria's face. Are you opposed to the idea? No, not opposed, Maria said slowly. Just overwhelmed. It's all happening so fast. A week ago, Theo was just playing piano at church. Now we're talking about the conservatory and private schools. She looked down at her hands, work-worn and calloused. These places, they cost money, Mrs. Whitfield. Money we don't have. That's the other matter I wanted to discuss, Eleanor said, her voice businesslike. I intend to establish a trust to cover Theodore's educational expenses. Maria looked up sharply. A trust? You mean, you want to pay for everything? I want to invest in Theodore's future, Eleanor corrected. Let's be practical, Maria. Your son has extraordinary potential that requires resources to develop. I have those resources and am willing to provide them, not as charity but as patronage. She leaned forward slightly. Throughout history, talented artists have needed patrons to flourish. Mozart had the Archbishop of Salzburg. Beethoven had Prince Lichnowsky. And you want to be Theo's patron, Maria said, trying to understand. Exactly. I would cover his educational expenses through college, provided he maintains both his academic standing and his musical development. Maria was silent for a long moment, her expression conflicted. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Whitfield, more than generous, but you have concerns, Eleanor stated. Yes. Theo is still a child, my child. If he accepts all this opportunity, what strings come attached? What would be expected of him, of us? Eleanor hadn't anticipated this question. She was accustomed to her generosity being met with simple gratitude, not careful consideration. There would be certain expectations, she acknowledged. Regular practice, of course. Dedication to his studies, perhaps occasional performances at my gatherings as he progresses. She hesitated. And there would be legal documents involved. The trust would have specific conditions regarding his education and career path. Maria nodded slowly. I see. And what about our lives? Would we need to move?
Would I need to leave my job?
Not immediately, Eleanor replied. Though eventually, if Theodore's talent develops as expected, he may need to be closer to the conservatory, perhaps in a home with space for a proper piano. She didn't mention that she had already begun inquiries about suitable apartments in areas that would accept a colored tenant. A limited selection, even in relatively progressive Boston. Maria fell silent again, her fingers worrying the edge of her apron. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. Before I agree to The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. It was the sort of personal inquiry that would never have been acceptable in her social circle, and certainly not from an employee. But there was no impertinence in Maria's tone, only a mother's need to protect her child. I believe in excellence, Eleanor said after a moment's consideration. In my life, I've had the privilege of recognizing and supporting quality, in art, in music, in craftsmanship. Theodore has a gift that could bring beauty to the world if properly nurtured. It would be wasteful to let it languish due to circumstance. She paused, then added more softly, "And perhaps, Maria, I see in your son something I once hoped for in my own life. I studied piano in Vienna as a young woman, but I lacked the natural talent to become truly great. Marriage and social obligations eventually replaced those aspirations. In Theodore, I see what genuine potential looks like." This admission, more personal than any she had made to Maria in 15 years of employment, hung in the air between them. Maria studied Eleanor's face, searching for something beyond the polished exterior. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. "Theo needs to be part of this decision," she said finally. "It's his life, his future. We should talk to him together." Eleanor nodded, surprisingly relieved by this response. "Of course. Shall we say tomorrow after school? He should hear about the audition arrangements anyway." "Yes, ma'am. I'll bring him here directly from school." Maria hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield, not just for the offer, but for seeing something in my boy that most people wouldn't even look for." Eleanor rose from the table, smoothing her skirt. "I have eyes, Maria, and ears. I simply paid attention." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Have you told Theodore how you came to work for me?" Maria looked surprised by the question. "No, ma'am. It never seemed important." "Perhaps you should," Eleanor suggested. "It might help him understand that this connection between our families isn't entirely coincidental." As Eleanor left the kitchen, Maria remained at the table, her thoughts turning to the past. She hadn't thought about it in years, how her late husband Robert had once been the chauffeur for Eleanor's husband William Whitfield. How when Robert died unexpectedly, leaving her with a 4-year-old son and no income, it was William who had mentioned that his wife needed a reliable housekeeper. Life worked in strange circles sometimes, Maria reflected. Robert had loved music too, had played guitar in church and taught their son to clap along to rhythms before he could even walk. Now, 8 years after his death, his son's musical gift was opening doors neither of them could have imagined. Maria returned to her silver polishing, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced ahead. There would be challenges, new schools, new expectations, a foot in a world that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like them. But there would be opportunities too, chances her son deserved to have. Whatever came next, Maria decided they would face it together, one note at a time. 15 years later, the concert hall of the Boston Symphony Orchestra glowed with soft amber light. Every seat was filled, the audience a sea of expectant faces beneath the ornate ceiling. Programs rustled as people pointed out notes of interest to their companions. On the stage stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano, its lid raised like a great black wing. In the front row, an elderly woman sat straight-backed and elegant despite her 80 years. Eleanor Whitfield's hair had gone completely white, but her eyes remained sharp as they focused on the empty stage. Beside her sat Maria Williams, now in her early 60s, her face etched with the lines of a life fully lived, her hands folded carefully over her program. "Nervous?" Eleanor asked, her voice low enough that only Maria could hear. Maria smiled. "Always. No matter how many concerts, I still get butterflies for him." "As do I," Eleanor admitted, though I'd never tell him so. Their conversation faded as the house lights dimmed. A hush fell over the audience. Then from stage left, a tall figure emerged. Theodore Williams walked to center stage with the confidence of a man who belonged there. At 27, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored tuxedo, his posture perfect as he faced the audience and bowed deeply. Applause filled the hall as he straightened and moved to the piano bench, adjusting it slightly before settling his hands above the keys. For a moment, he was perfectly still. Then his fingers descended, and the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the hall. The orchestra joined, and together they built the piece's famous melancholy themes into soaring emotional heights. Theo's hands flew across the keyboard during the intricate passages, then softened for the lyrical moments, his body swaying slightly with the music. In the audience, a young music student leaned toward his companion. "He's incredible," he whispered. The way he plays, it's like he's not just performing the music, he's living it. Did you read his story in the program? His friend whispered back. He started with just church lessons. Some rich lady discovered him playing at her house when he was 12. Now he's one of the top pianists in the country. On stage, Theo was lost in the world of Rachmaninoff, his fingers coaxing both power and delicacy from the instrument. As the concerto reached its triumphant conclusion, the audience rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Theo stood, bowing first to the orchestra and conductor, then to the audience. His eyes found his mother and Eleanor in the front row, and a private smile passed between them. After several curtain calls, Theo left the stage. The audience began to file out, buzzing with praise for the performance. Eleanor and Maria remained seated, waiting for the crowd to thin before making their way to the reception area. He played beautifully tonight, Eleanor said. I believe it was his best Rachmaninoff yet. You say that every time, Maria replied with a gentle laugh. Because he improves every time, Eleanor countered. That's the mark of a true artist. Never satisfied, always growing. They made their way slowly to the reception hall where patrons in evening wear clustered around cocktail tables. Theo stood near the center of the room, surrounded by well-wishers. He excused himself when he spotted his mother and Eleanor. There are my two favorite critics, he said, embracing Maria warmly before taking Eleanor's hand. What did you think? You played like you meant it, Maria said simply. Your father would have been so proud. The phrasing in the second movement was especially fine, Eleanor added. Though I still think you take the allegro a touch too quickly. Theo laughed. 15 years of the finest musical education money can buy and you still find something to correct. Of course, Eleanor replied with a slight smile. That's why you've gotten as far as you have. Someone has to keep you humble. Their friendly banter was interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished-looking man with silver-streaked hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Theodore, marvelous performance, he said, shaking Theo's hand. The foundation board was most impressed. Thank you, Mr. Lowell, Theo replied. May I present my mother, Maria Williams, and Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, my patron and mentor. Ladies, this is Howard Lowell, director of the Northeastern Arts Foundation. Pleasantries were exchanged, and then Mr. Lowell turned back to Theo. I wanted to let you know personally that the board has approved your proposal. Full funding for the next 5 years. Theo's face lit up. That's wonderful news. Thank you. Don't thank me, Mr. Lowell said. Your presentation was compelling, and your track record speaks for itself. The Williams Young Artist Program is exactly the kind of initiative we want to support. After Mr. Lowell moved on to greet other guests, Eleanor raised an eyebrow at Theo. 5 years of funding secured, impressive. I assume this means you'll be cutting back on your performance schedule? Some, Theo acknowledged. I'll still do the major concert series and recordings, but yes. The program will take more of my time now. Tell me again about these students of yours, Maria requested, taking a seat at a nearby table as her arthritis made standing for long periods uncomfortable. Theo sat beside her, his eyes brightening with enthusiasm. We've identified 30 young musicians from low-income neighborhoods across Boston. Kids who show real promise but have no access to instruments or proper instruction. Each one will receive an instrument, weekly lessons, music theory classes, and performance opportunities. And you'll teach them yourself? Eleanor asked, joining them at the table, some of them. I've also recruited colleagues from the symphony and the conservatory as instructors. The important thing is that these kids will have what I didn't have at their age. Structured training from the beginning, not just piecing things together from records and Sunday lessons. Maria reached out to touch her son's hand. Mr. Washington would be so pleased to know what you're doing. He always said you'd go far. He was my first real teacher, Theo said. I wish he could have lived to see where that path led. The church music director had passed away 10 years earlier, but had lived long enough to see Theo give his first professional recital at Carnegie Hall at 17. He had traveled to New York for the performance, sitting proudly in the audience alongside Maria and Eleanor. Speaking of paths, Eleanor said, the dean of the conservatory mentioned they're considering you for a visiting professor position next fall. Are you interested? Maybe, Theo replied. It would complement the youth program nicely. He looked between the two women thoughtfully. Did I ever tell you both what Dean Phillips said to me after that first audition? Both women shook their heads. He said, young man, Talent like yours comes along once in a generation. But talent alone doesn't create a career. You'll need discipline, education, and support. He was right about everything, especially the support part. Theo's voice softened. I've had an extraordinary amount of that from both of you. The conversation paused as a photographer from the Boston Globe approached, asking for a photo of the evening soloist with his guests. The three posed together, an unlikely trio bonded by music and 15 years of shared history. After the reception, Theo accompanied his mother and Eleanor to the waiting car that would take them back to the Whitfield residence. Though Maria had her own apartment now, she often stayed in the guest room at Eleanor's after Theo's performances, the two women sharing late-night tea and memories. Will you play for us when we get home? Eleanor asked as the car pulled away from the curb. Something small and personal, not for an audience. Just for us, of course, Theo replied. What would you like to hear? That piece you played at your very first performance at my house, Eleanor said. Your improvisation. I've always wondered how it would sound now, with all your training and experience behind it. Theo nodded, looking out at the Boston streets sliding by, remembering the nervous 12-year-old boy he had been, playing for a room of strangers in a borrowed suit. It won't be the same, he warned. I'm not the same. None of us are, Maria said softly. That's as it should be. Back at the Whitfield home, now more familiar to Theo than the small apartment where he'd grown up. He sat at Eleanor's Steinway, not the same one he'd first played on, but its more magnificent replacement. His fingers found the keys and he began to play. The melody started simply, echoing the spiritual themes of his childhood improvisation. But now it developed with greater complexity and assurance, incorporating elements of classical structure he'd mastered at the conservatory, jazz harmonies he'd studied in New York, and a depth of emotion that could only come from a life fully lived. The music spoke of struggle and triumph, of doors opening and horizons expanding, of the extraordinary journey from a church piano to the world's great concert halls. As the final notes faded into the quiet room, Theo turned to see both women with tears in their eyes. That, Eleanor said, her voice unusually thick, is why I stopped at the kitchen door that day. I heard something special in your playing even then. And I knew it was in you from the first time you picked out Amazing Grace on our neighbor's piano when you were 4, Maria added. Some gifts are just waiting to be recognized. Theo looked at these two women, so different in background, circumstance, and personality, who had together shaped his life through their belief in his talent. One had provided opportunity and access to a world that would have remained closed to him otherwise. The other had given unwavering love and the courage to walk through those newly opened doors. The greatest gift, he said, wasn't the music. It was having people who could hear it, even when I was just beginning to find my way. Everything else, the schools, the concerts, the career, all of that came after. But it started with being heard. Outside the window, Boston's lights twinkled against the night sky. Somewhere in those neighborhoods were children whose gifts might never be discovered, whose talents might remain hidden for lack of opportunity or recognition. But 30 of them would soon have a chance they might not otherwise have had, because a wealthy woman once asked her maid son to play the piano, not knowing he was a genius, until she took the time to listen.